what I've seen is that MSc is a good way for getting people back to going, oh, this is really interesting
Yeah,
to talk to
yeah,
people
yeah,
about what difference we make.
yeah.
I'm really learning. People have said, I've not thought about evaluation as excitedly for years since I
Mm,
started doing
brilliant.
this. And that when I work with organizations, that's often where you get to, is that it, when it works most positively, it's because people come out of the process going, we're all on the same team and we've got this shared purpose,
Yeah,
and we are
yes.
making a difference in tune with our shared purpose. Because I think that depth of thinking that you can get when you think about story in a structured way is something that could lead to a healthier sector. That's I suppose that's what I'm always thinking about, is how does this help us lead to a more effective, more equitable, more resilient sector?
So I'm delighted on the first episode of my new podcast series to welcome my long-standing associate Mark Robinson to a conversation today about most significant change. Mark, hi. I'm
Hi
wondering if
there.
you could, I'm wondering if you wanted to start off by just giving us a bit of a potted history of who you are and what your work history's been to this point.
Blimey. Um, how long have you got? So yeah, I'm Mark Robinson. I'm beaming in from Stockton on Tees, from the parish of Preston on Tees, in
Mhm.
Eaglescliff. I grew up in Preston in Lancashire, so over on the right side of the Pennines, like you. But I've lived here 30 odd years now. And my working career is slightly unusual, maybe. After I left university, where I studied English and French, I went off and became a vegetarian chef, um,
Mhm.
uh, and worked in vegetarian catering in the late 80s, early 90s, when vegetarian restaurants were a bit thinner on the ground than they are now.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, as was I, actually, a little thinner on the ground, um, than I am now. Um, uh, I did that for, I don't know, 6 years, something like that, in different places. But I was writing. I'm a poet and a writer, by craft, I suppose. And so while I was working as in restaurants, trying to change the world through vegetarian food, I was also learning to write, I suppose. And then I started a poetry magazine called Scratch, um, uh, which became a press, and I published, was kind of heavily involved in small press, poetry publishing and poetry events and things like that, but on a voluntary, or unpaid basis most of the time. Um, and then eventually sort of wanted to do that more practically, really wanted to get into the cultural sector, I suppose, even though I probably didn't call it that at the time. I managed, after a couple of goes, to persuade uh, an interview panel to give me a job in the arts, which is when we moved to Teesside. So I worked in literature development, helping people write, um, putting festivals on, doing adult education, community arts, I suppose, and then gradually through that moved into different spheres, of adult education and community work, and then joined Northern Arts, the Regional Arts Board, as was about the turn of the century, to move into the funding system, as we used to call it, um, uh, and help build the sector in that way, I suppose, from that position. That turned into Arts Council England when it all became one organisation, and through various twists and turns, I ended up being the executive director in the Northeast, so the head of the Northeast bit of the Arts Council and part of the national exec team, which was a bit of a surprise to me. It's probably some other people. Did that I was there for 10 years, in different roles, and then left in 2010 to set up Thinking Practice, which is my own independent practice, through which I've done organizational development, coaching, research, evaluation of different sorts, for over 15 years now. So
Mm.
it's the longest single line on my CV. Um, written a lot about resilience, done a lot of work around leadership as well. but then in recent years done more evaluation. So yeah, that's the potted history, I think. I don't know whether quite what kind of story that tells, but
no, it's useful for people to know where you're coming from. I think that's really helpful. And of course, we've been working together on various evaluations for, I don't know, I was just trying to think, must be about 8 years or so, I guess,
well, I think
maybe, I don't know, something like that.
It's longer than that, I think.
Is
actually,
it? Oh,
because I think the first piece of work that we might have worked on together, and there's a reason why it sticks in my head, was the piece of work to do with, which was through EW group,
yeah,
wasn't it?
yeah,
I think
Equality Works, yeah.
Connected, because I always remember trying to write, I think, that piece of work around education and young people, maybe.
Yes, and equality and diversity and the arts.
But I
It's
always remember
multi-sector.
trying to write a draft of that as when my daughter was in labour with my grandson,
So that
and
gives
he's
us a
10
sense.
now, so
A good,
it's at least 10 years.
yeah.
Yes, I always remember a long day when she was in hospital trying to with me writing it and
Yeah.
emailing various people. So yeah, it's 10 years since that. So yeah, it was that through that EW, and then we did Celebrating Age
Yes, we
together with
evaluate. Yes, and
us two
that's
and Lorna, which is probably the
yeah,
biggest piece of work that we did originally, just
certainly.
the three of us, which
Yes.
turned into a long piece of work.
A very long piece of work. And of course, it was when we were doing that national evaluation of Arts Council and Arts Council England and Bearing Foundation's Celebrating Age programme, which, for those who aren't familiar, was was it 4 year in the end, probably? Maybe even 5, given
5, I
COVID.
think, because of COVID, yeah.
It was a huge national programme of funding for arts organisations working in partnership with a whole range of other local partners to deliver participatory arts projects involving older people in different ways as audience members, artists, so on and so forth. And it was while we were working on that project, while we were originally designing it with our other collaborator, Lorna Easterbrook, that I think it was Lorna's idea actually, that we came across Most Significant Change as a way of trying to evaluate a very disparate program of work with 33, I think there were, different projects all up and down the country, all doing very different things, that we were thinking, God, how on earth are we going to evaluate these very different projects with a, not very particularly generous budget? And that was where we sort of came up with the idea of using Most Significant Change. So I just wonder, before we get into that, for those who aren't aware of Most Significant Change, whether you just want to give a little potted summary of, what you see the approach being, really, what it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way I tend to describe it now, and I suppose before I get into that, we should acknowledge that phrase "most significant change" comes from Rick Davies and Jess Dart's
Absolutely,
work
yes, it's not ours.
originally, and I think we've all adapted it slightly and fitted it to circumstance. So for me, it's one of those things that's really useful technique, because it is partly because it is so adaptable actually to different cultures, different settings, and so on. So the way I often think about it now is, if you think about it has two sides. It's got two sides to the coin. One is the sharing of a story, and the creation of a story, almost the co-creation of a story. Actually, I think I increasingly think about it now between an interviewer and a story sharer. A story sharer and story shaper was the phrase I came up with recently to try and describe that, because I suppose it's that thing of, as an evaluator, you're helping somebody to find the shape in their own story, on that side of the coin. And then on the other side of the coin is the thinking about stories, and the reflection and the analysis. And it's for me, the power of MSC as a tool within evaluation is that it brings those two things together in a way that's counter to the way they're often separated in many evaluations. So stories, and I suppose I'm drawn to it because I'm a writer and a reader. So I come at it but I think you don't have to be of that ilk. So yeah, it's about developing stories, collecting stories, helping people find their own stories that they want to express, and then bringing groups of people together to think about them, that they can then feed into the analysis that is part of any evaluation. Sometimes it's a standalone technique or the main technique. Sometimes it's part of a range of tools that you might need for an evaluation. You know, story isn't the opposite of data, just as qualitative isn't the opposite of quantitative. I don't think we often talk about them as if they're opposites, but they're not really. They're just two different things. So for me, it's been really fascinating. So it fits in any evaluation framework that or it can be a useful tool, but you need to know what you're trying to do, what question you're trying to explore or answer, and then you can use stories to do that.
Great. And I mean, we touched obviously on the Celebrating Age program that we first kind of tried to apply this through, and how, but I'm just wondering generally, how have you applied it in your own work? You mentioned, of course, your work through thinking practice and the kind of evaluation and support you offer to the cultural sector. What sort of, where have you used it?
Well, there's been a range, I suppose. Part of what I've done is help people embed it into their organizations and into their organizational approaches to evaluation and to thinking about what their organization does. And the other is using it as a tool where I am the evaluator or part of the evaluation team. And because that's the sort of role that I often play, is sometimes people need that independent eye and voice and thought process. Sometimes it's more appropriate to pass the skills on and then people can crack on with it themselves. So for instance, I suppose the deepest kind of way I've done that with an organization is actually with my local arts centre, ARC in Stockton. So medium-sized arts centre, the director, who's also the co-director of Future Arts Centres, the network of of arts centres across the UK that I've done a lot of work with them around MSc, wanted to try and get her board at the time closer to the experiences that the staff were having, and wanted to get the staff to think about those as well, alongside the more traditional reporting in the board. So we started off. We started off by training some members of the team to collect stories and to think about them. Train the management team, and I did a bit of facilitation early on to get them into the habit of thinking about story in different ways. So they developed a thing where teams would collect stories, management team would have a panel, as we might call it, or a reflection group, and think about the stories, and they would pass those on to the board members. So the board stories came to be embedded in the board papers alongside the more, the kind of more traditional material that they had. So, and although it took a bit of practice, because that's not the kind of discussion often that you're used to at board meetings, where it's about, much more often, and it was a good board, it was a reflective board, but they were more used to working through the business, approving the decisions, trying to, paying attention to all the things that boards have to pay attention to. And then they actually built further onto that into their annual all staff sessions. So their annual all staff and board sessions came to include MSc stories. So for me, that was a really interesting one, because it was it built in multiple perspectives to their thinking. They did them in chunks of different themes. They might look at artists at one point, artists' experience of working in the arts centre, or they might look at audiences or users of the building. And they really came to see that the things that people valued weren't necessarily always what the staff valued.
Interesting.
They weren't in conflict, but they were just, people were taking what they wanted from that, and that was really interesting for them to think about and go, oh, okay. So actually, it's what I remember from the first sessions was, it became clear that it wasn't so much what was going on in the arts centre that people were primarily interested as to whether they got a nice welcome when they came
Mm.
in, or even if they were just coming in for a cup of coffee or
Yeah.
just to sit. Because people were using that venue
Mm.
for all sorts of reasons in their lives.
Mm.
They were
Mm.
using it for an hour out the house as respite from caring responsibilities.
Mm. Mm.
And actually, the specifics of what performing arts or visual arts they were coming to see wasn't people's primary. Whereas the people in the organisation, that's their bread and
That was
butter.
their main driver, yeah.
So it was about trying to put
Mm.
those things together. So that's, and we've done a lot of that. And through the network Future Arts Centres, we've sort of tried to give people the skills to do that in their own organisation. So the last 2 or 3 years, we've done action research groups and learning groups that have probably, well, I was looking at it yesterday, actually. I mean, probably getting on for 50 organizations, but then there's been cascading within those organizations. So it's, several hundred people now in those art centres across the UK
Mm.
that have been trained in MSc,
Yeah.
story collection
Wow.
and reflection. Um,
Mm.
so it's been that, and then I've used it in individual evaluations, some of which we worked on together. Where we've, for me, it's a really good tool, particularly for complex projects.
Mm.
I don't know whether
Mm.
you'd agree, but I
Mm.
think
Mm.
that's the thing that I find it most helpful in, is
Yeah.
where there's really, lots of different stakeholders, lots of different points of view on whatever
Mm.
the topic is. Um, and that's because, again, as I often say, that's what we develop story for.
Mm.
As a
Mm.
as a species,
Yeah.
stories are like these incredibly efficient carriers of meaning.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of hardwired into us
Yeah.
to think
Absolutely.
about story.
Yeah.
Even a very short, in words or time, story can carry layers and layers and layers of cultural
Mm.
meaning and reference if you alert to them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in those projects, I suppose, yeah, you might say are complex, but I think almost anything in the arts, cultural, kind of human people
Mm,
sectors is complex, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, yeah,
we're rarely looking at an intervention with a really clear, measurable, consistently measurable kind of outcome, where we can kind of go, let's measure this at the start, let's measure that at the end, and we're all in agreement that things have had an impact or that they haven't had an impact. Often we're looking at projects where we're not really sure what sort of impacts they're having on different people, and everybody will have different ideas about that. And I like the way you describe that. And I think also I think it's really important, that point about this not just being an evaluation tool, but actually being a real journey that organizations can go on in terms of building their capacity, thinking about ways in which they might apply this methodology to really kind of hear different voices, to kind of go on a bit of a journey of, I suppose, continuous improvement, but that sounds a bit kind of performance management-ish, but
yeah.
reflection, I guess, might be
Yeah, I
better.
guess so. And I think what it does as well is it gives you a structure to think about stories, because
Mm,
otherwise certain stories can have much greater prominence in organizations. They become like little myths. So you remember that person who, and
yes.
and and that might have value, but if you're putting it in a structure to go, well, that person had that experience, but
Yeah.
these people had this other one, or that person had that experience, and actually it's the same as these ones. You can start to spot the patterns. And I think
Yeah.
that's what MSc does, and that's why it's not, sometimes someone who's uh, cynical about the process or the methodology might go, well, these are just stories. This is just anecdotes,
Mm,
really. And can I have some numbers? Or can I have a survey? And it's numbers and surveys have their place. But if you put stories into a structure to think about them, you can
yeah.
come to, I was going to say rely, but you can come to use them more effectively.
Mm,
I think. Um, and I suppose it's also that thing of, even where we know what the outcome is, stories can help us think about what created that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. The why, the causes of it all, and to what
Yeah,
people attribute that. Often people got
yeah,
really different
yeah.
ideas because the cause isn't one kind of thing to be discovered
No, it might be
necessarily,
really
is it?
complex, but
Yeah, yeah.
and again, that goes right back to why stories are so powerful. I read a fascinating book recently called The Science of Storytelling by Will
Oh,
Storr.
okay.
And one of the things that he says in that is, because he talks about he's coming at it from lots of different scientific perspectives or on scientific evidence, and the way the brain works is we create cause and effects,
Mm,
and
mm,
that's kind of what story is.
mm, absolutely. And kind of
Any
what we're asked
kind
to
of
do as
story you want to
evaluators
pick,
in a way. Yeah, yeah.
um, whether that's a literary story or a story of your day,
Mm, mm,
there's off we look for cause and effect, even if we don't realize it.
mm, mm.
You've had a really bad day at work. Why was it such a
Yeah,
bad day at work?
yeah, yeah.
Whose fault was that?
Yeah,
All
yeah,
of that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. What was
It's
it that
cause and
set that off?
effect. And therefore,
Yeah.
if you give somebody a story of what happens when they interact with an organization, whether it's an arts organization or a health organization or a housing group, our brain in this looks for cause and effect. Now we can manage that and go,
Mm,
let's not look for the most simplistic cause and effect, because it can be complex, as you say. But for me, it's really it's powerful because it's instinctive.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And we look
And
for cause and effect, even if you give certain people a spreadsheet or a set of numbers,
mm,
we'll
mm.
look for cause and effect.
Yeah, 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 for
There's
patterns in
brackets at
there.
the
Yeah.
bottom. What's caused that loss?
Mm, mm, mm,
Where's the overspend or the underachievement in income?
mm, mm,
Um, uh, so for me, that's really interesting when you come to 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 thinking about evaluation, which is about learning,
mm,
and what
mm.
do we do differently in future, or what do we do more on in future?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm struck by your point about, and you touched on anecdote, in people, this kind of drive towards
Yeah.
hard data and a resistance of the anecdotal. I mean, I remember certainly in some of my conversations in the sort of arts and cultural sector, and right across the community voluntary sector as well, this
Mhm.
kind of, loads of people have said to me over the years, oh, we've got some great anecdotal evidence, but unfortunately that's all it is. And
Mm.
I think for me, MSc can provide people, as you say, with that kind of structure, to turn what is anecdotal evidence into something which is more structured, which we can rely on a little bit more as a source of evidence. So I'm
Mm.
just wondering, what do you sort of see as the particular fit between MSc and the arts and cultural sector? Do you think there's a particular kind of
Um, I don't know how particular it is. I mean, I suppose you could say the cultural sector is about if it's a reductive statement. If we say it's about culture and image,
mm,
whether that's performing arts or visual arts, often the things that stick in people's heads from stories are particular images or phrases that people will use, or you
mm,
have it creates an image of someone using a service in a particular way, or the world opening up in a particular way. And I think often people are open to that.
mm,
Um, I think there are some people in the sector, in the arts sector, who are kind of resistant to quantitative data,
yeah.
and often in ways that they perhaps ought not to be, or that would be healthier if they weren't, because I think numbers are stories too,
Mm,
um,
mm,
uh,
yeah.
if you put them together. So sometimes I come across a lot of survey fatigue
Yeah,
in people,
absolutely.
and also what I call evaluation ennui, which
Sounds much classier.
well, it's that French degree still comes in useful, and but of course the just to dig myself deeper into that hole. I think I said that one day because I like the sound of it, the two E's. But actually, it's sort of, I think it's probably, and it was one of those things I realised afterwards was truer than I thought, because ennui is, if you go back to Baudelaire, French
Hmm.
poet,
Hmm.
uh, uh, his definition of ennui was the desire for desire. So it's often ennui is the French word for boredom, but actually when he uses it, it's that thing where you're so bored you don't even want anything to happen.
Right.
So it's the desire for desire. And I think people have that about evaluation in the cultural sector. They know that they ought to be interested in evaluation often, not just because it's put on them as an obligation by funders, report it, but actually they're kind of, yeah, we should be learning, but also they're always off onto the next thing. So they kind of have this desire for to want to do evaluation, but they still don't. They're not at that point yet.
Yeah.
Some people, not everybody. And I think what I've seen is that MSc is a good way for getting people back to going, oh, this is really interesting to talk to people about what difference we make. I'm really learning. People have said, I've not thought about evaluation as excitedly for years since I started doing this. And hopefully that's the beginning of a journey for them of going, what happens when we think about what's actually happening in our practice? Um, so yeah, I think the cultural sector kind of often feels like it has frames put upon it from outside.
Yes, and those kind of funder requirements, I know
Yeah,
it can feel difficult for people to break out from that, can't it? And to
yeah, it
collect the
can.
very stories that they sort of feel they want to collect, but then it's like, who gives permission for that to happen? Sometimes it's quite tricky, isn't it?
It is, and I suppose we did that piece of work during COVID, didn't we? Which was a sort of follow-up to Celebrating Age to do with loneliness. And there was a lot of resistance from people in that, really, wasn't there, to having that frame put upon their work, even though they knew that it was having an effect on isolation, that some of the evaluation frameworks that were being imposed upon that from outside, which I suppose are to do with value for money regimes and return investment regimes and economic regimes of ultimately. That was a very awkward fit, as I recall that conversation, as well as some of the vocab around loneliness.
Yeah, that was a very much a kind of, let's design a survey to measure the actual impact that's been had, and people, found that, created a lot of anxiety, didn't it, in a way, I think
Yeah,
it's fair to
and
say.
I don't think, did we do MSc on that one? I
No,
don't
we
think we
didn't.
did.
No, no,
We
no.
didn't because of the frame, and I think we probably that if we'd had a freer field,
We
we
haven't had a
might have done
frame
that.
put on us. We might have done it
Yeah,
too.
yeah. Well, that's often the way when you're working as an as an independent evaluator.
Yeah.
The client of the commissioner will have their own frames in which they're operating.
Absolutely. And I often, I often kind of regret it when there hasn't been an MSc element in it, either because I've thought perhaps I shouldn't just do MSc all the time, or because the
Yeah.
frame hasn't been to do that. I often kind of get to a point in evaluation where I think, oh, we need a layer of MSc in here now. We really want to gather different perspectives and see what's going on. But I guess, over the time we've been using it, we've also, I suppose, come to kind of reflect on some of the limitations, I suppose, and think about what some of those dangers, not exactly dangers, but I mean, are there some health warnings, do you think, in terms of how we apply it?
Well, I think there are a few. I mean, I suppose the conscious and unconscious bias is one.
Yes,
Um,
it comes up a lot. Sure.
in terms of who you invite to share stories, who you invite to think about the stories, how you frame that conversation, and again, some really interesting things where people have worked with that. One of the art centres that was part of the first action research group, after their first reflection session on some stories, they thought, these are a bit cozy. That we kind of knew this because we kind of knew these people, and they very deliberately put time and effort into finding people that either they'd lost touch with, so maybe people who were on their database who hadn't been to the centre for a couple of years, or people that they knew they had slightly kind of more, variable relationships with. And they found they got much more learning out of the conversation from those stories
Interesting.
than the first set. So it is that thing of deliberately kind of, once you're kind of confident with the technique, increasing your confidence zone by going out a little bit, talking to that person that you think's a bit awkward, or who thinks you're a bit awkward.
Yeah.
To see what can be learnt from there. So I think that's one. I mean, it does take a bit of time and practice.
Yeah.
And sometimes in pressured organizations that are under pressure, that can be tricky, or can feel luxurious. If somebody's under pressure for targets to do with their work, and you're asking them to spend time thinking about this, sometimes that can be a bit of a bit of a tension. I mean, time is one of the things that comes up a lot. I think for some people, looping it back to, so what are we going to do or not do, or introduce or stop? That's a discipline that, you know, I think is really, really crucial. But some people find if they're not always in the habit of rooting things back to action, you can have an interesting conversation and it kind of floats off after the meeting,
Yeah.
and therefore doesn't come to feel as valuable.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the ones that I've noticed. I think actually there's one other which is I've become more conscious of, which is to do with the sort of editing and writing of the stories. No, so I talk about writing because I tend to do it in text myself, but even if you're doing it in video or audio, the shaping of them, even though that's approved by the writer, it does take a bit of practice and some skill.
Absolutely.
And I think making sure that all the stories are sort of developed to a similar finish, standard is really quite important, because otherwise you can miss stuff. You can miss learning if people get hooked on, well, there's not a lot of detail in the story, or there's too much detail, that sort of thing. So I think that sort of editorial eye, no matter what format you're actually sharing stories, is I've come to think that's a bit more important, perhaps than I did early on in using this technique.
Absolutely. There is a real art to getting that right, isn't there? And and I think there's some really interesting reflections there, Mark, of thinking about that sort of journey from evaluation being, a way of almost collecting some nice PR stories. Let's go over and find out what they have thought about our work, and let's kind of, collect some nice, as you say, sort of kind of cozy stories, to kind of a recognition actually that, there's so much more kind of power to be had here, really, and that you can play around with that, and you can, obviously it's more uncomfortable, isn't it, but you can really use that to kind of reflect back. I remember having a conversation with somebody during the Celebrating Age program, one of the projects, saying, our older people don't want to, they're very resistant to the idea of kind of talking to us and telling us how great we are. And it's like, well, we're not asking we're not asking you to ask them how great you are. We're giving them absolutely, handing them the microphone and asking them what difference this has or hasn't made. You encourage them to be as bullshit as they want about that. That's where the sparks will fly. And they were suddenly like, oh, actually, that's quite interesting. That's quite radical. And that, for that organization, I think really sent them off on a particular journey, where I think before there was this kind of sense that we're all going to gather up these lovely stories about older people having an amazing time, and we're going to filter them all the way back up to Arts Council. Everyone's going to pat each other on the back and it's all going to be lovely. But actually, often it's when you get, I don't know, you get the people running an organization to tell their stories and ask a group of people that, might be seen as the beneficiaries to comment on whether or not they think that's actually, what do they make of that actually you can start to have some much more kind of radical conversations through this approach, can't you?
I guess it's because that evaluation, there's a culture around evaluation, isn't there? Or a set of cultural aspects to evaluation that sometimes mean that people see it as, we've got an evaluation to do for this, I need a report for such and such a funder. And that often has sort of over time and sort of slipped into, we'll get the numbers and then we'll give them some good news.
Yes, absolutely.
And and that's not that's not unreasonable behavior in the system in a way.
No, because that's what you need to do to get
But
funding for the next
what
project.
it doesn't do is get to the learning of about how you might do things even better in future. And that's what I think, no matter what tool you use, whether you use MSC or otherwise, you need to open up that conversation to be more than that. I mean, that's why, as we've done on a couple of things, I often use MSC, which is a very, tends to be positive. It's a kind of asset-based
Yes,
approach in a way,
it
isn't it?
is. Yes.
Positivistic, if that's even a word. So I often complement that, and we've done this with Failspace, that technique,
Yes.
which explicitly asks about, okay, so it worked for these people. Are there any people it didn't work for, or any circumstances it didn't work in? And that explicitly uses that word failure. And and that's hard for people sometimes. I mean, I've certainly experienced it where groups, even though consciously they might be going, yeah, that'd be good to talk about failure, they still find it really difficult to talk about either their own failures or someone else's.
Absolutely.
Because we're not culturally, well, in evaluation terms, we're not used to that. I mean, there's a whole conversation about actually in other terms, we're really happy beating ourselves up about our failings of one sort or another. In the arts and in the social sector more broadly, I think, nothing we like better than saying what we can't do.
But suddenly in that evaluative moment, the stakes feel high, don't they?
As soon as someone's writing it down or recording it. So I think that for me that those two often work well as a pair, just to check as a it's not triangulation, is it, because there's only two, but just to kind of go, is this telling us roughly the same story as that, or is there something different that we can learn from, that's coming out from that? I mean, even if I'm using MSC, I will often inject bits of that if I'm facilitating the reflection conversation. I might go, well, this is a successful story, but are there any moments it could have gone wrong?
That's
It's
nice.
quite an interesting conversation to set up within an organization. Again, I go thinking about that career description I gave at the beginning. I often go back to catering. There was nothing more instructive than a complaint for helping us
think about
fix
improving your
something.
offer.
And it didn't matter that it was only one customer who got a stone in their lentils.
Yes.
If they'd broken their tooth, there was an improvement to be made there. And complaints are stories of change.
No, that's a really, good point.
Almost every business, if they treat complaints seriously, is in a way doing MSC.
No, that's a really good way of putting at it.
Maybe there's an article about TripAdvisor comments as MSC, but
Perhaps
because
there's a whole
sometimes you
new.
read them and you go, not important, not significant, or it
Yes.
doesn't matter to us, or
Yes.
completely wrong. I think that's the other thing I suppose that we've not touched on, that over the years of using it, I've come to emphasize more, which is that the significance part isn't necessarily about scale. It's about what matters to you most.
Yes.
And I think that was one of the things that when I first started using it, I'm not sure I communicated very effectively, because most significant sounds like which is the biggest.
Yes.
And it's not that for me. It's always necessarily. It's what matters to you most.
Absolutely.
So, which is about values and purpose in your organization.
Absolutely. And that's why you can end up with people, feeling that actually the welcome they get, and whether or not there's a nice place to sit and have a cup of tea, is just as important as the quality of the programming in an organization, isn't it? And that's
that's right.
Really, really important.
And equally, other people might look at it and go, I don't care that we've got a really tatty building and no cafe, because I can do the out there art that I want to in that space, and I don't have to worry about those things. And none of them are, they're not the right answer. There's no right and wrong answers. It's about what matters to you in your circumstance. So and that, when I work with organizations, that's often where you get to is that when it works most positively, it's because people come out of the process going, we're all on the same team and we've got this shared purpose,
Yeah,
and we are
yes.
making a difference in tune with our shared purpose.
Yeah, because I guess those conversations about what other people value help you to kind of filter through all the differences that you might have, or not differences that you might have on,
Yeah,
say, a board, about what we're really trying to do here. You know, what matters most? Are we creating a safe, welcoming social space, or are we all about putting on cutting edge art, or can we do both at the
yeah,
same time? How do we prioritize those things? That all kind of comes out, doesn't it?
yeah, and it can bring out those differences, because it's only when you notice and acknowledge the difference that you can come to any kind of synthesis, really. That's, I always emphasize that when you in the reflection thing, it's noticing what matters to somebody else
Mm,
is
mm,
as important as noticing what matters to you. Because if I
absolutely.
notice what matters to you and it's either the same or slightly different to what I do, I can go, okay, so we're bringing that together, and that's how we might we
Mhm.
might use that. And obviously, that's those different perspectives are shaped by all sorts of factors. The
Absolutely. Yeah.
people and their diversity, their jobs and their positions in the organization. And that's, that I think that's one of the things where when boards can get involved, it can be really powerful,
Mm,
because board, I suppose I'm thinking charitable boards here mainly, or
mm,
CIC type boards. Um, they're often necessarily at one remove from the work.
yeah, yeah,
Unless it's a really volunteer kind of
yeah,
organization.
yeah.
If you're thinking with professional staff,
Mm,
in most circumstances, the last thing most organizations need is board members running sessions and getting involved in
yeah, yeah,
things
yeah.
hands on. It's not, but that often leads to a gap of them not
Mm,
really understanding,
mm,
or having the windows to understand what's happening in those sessions and what they might be achieving or not.
mm.
So if MSc can give them a way of being closer to the action
Yeah,
without
yeah,
being involved in the action,
yeah,
and they can
yes.
think about it with that distance in a way. And I think that's potentially really useful, because it's a fairly common thing, isn't it, that staff go, well, the board are having these decisions, but they don't know what I'm doing on a Tuesday
Yeah,
morning.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the board are going, well, we're at a distance, but we've got to decide which of these
Mm,
programs we put
mm,
more money into or less money into.
mm, mm.
And MSc is not the only answer to that, but it can really help,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. So I'm just going to end up really by asking you what changes or learning have come about for you personally or professionally from using MSc. What differences
Yeah,
it made to you?
this is like one of those where when I do a training session and we've got an odd number of people in the
I
group.
know.
So I have to do it because so I don't know about you, but when I'm training people, I always get them to spend
Ah,
some
absolutely.
time sharing and collecting stories,
Absolutely.
because
You can only
it's
learn
so
this by
powerful.
doing it, can't you? Definitely. Yeah.
As a thing, and usually I take it as a free coaching session
Yeah, yeah,
when
absolutely.
I have to do that. But I suppose when I think back, and I have been thinking back a little bit, because thinking practice has just turned 15,
Yeah,
so
congratulations.
that awkward spotty stage. Um, um, Wondering what it might do with its life. Um, uh, and I suppose the MS celebrating age probably came in, sort of in the middle of that
Mm,
period. Now, it's not been a
mm.
straight line at all. It's been a
No.
series of cycles. But I suppose since I started working with it, I probably have evaluation has become a bigger part of the work
Yes.
through
Mhm,
most
mhm.
significant change, through thinking practice. Um, and I suppose a kind of more central part of what
Mhm.
I've done. I mean, I'd always done evaluations as part of the mix. I'm very much I'm very much a Swiss Army knife
Mhm, mhm.
consultancy rather than
Yeah.
hyper specialist, a multifunction kind of thing, which has served me well. Don't know about other people, but it served me well. So I've done more evaluation, and I've become I've kind of got deeper into it. Um, uh, and it's become part of spreading that kind of more. For me, there's a real part of my, again, I frame things in stories, I suspect, but it's become part of my argument with the sector to be more resilient, more inclusive, more open, to a much wider range of people than any parts of it are historically. That's always been kind of my focus, going back to when I was stapling poetry pamphlets after a shift in the restaurant. And I think NSC is part of that because it's about learning, but it's also about co-creation.
Yeah.
It's about co-creation of the stories. It's about co-creation of the reflection. Um, uh, it's not generally about co-creation of actually writing it up, because that's still the bit that often needs to happen. But for me, it's become part of that. So it's become a bigger part of my work, actually.
Yeah.
And I don't use it on every evaluation job.
No, no.
Sometimes uh, it doesn't. It sometimes it feels too onerous for the scale.
Yeah, yeah. Use other bits of the Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
but I'll be informed by story,
Mm,
I suppose, in my analysis. So, I did a piece of work over the last year, looking at uh, a partnership between an art centre in North Belfast, urban North Belfast, and a kind of, let's call it a music pub in uh, in a tiny little village in West Cork called Ballydale, a place called Levis's Corner House. And it's been about artist exchange between those two places. Now, if I tried to do MSc in that, and it would have been overkill, I suspect. But the interesting narrative was absolutely part of all the conversations I had with artists and the people working in those venues,
Yeah.
to get to something that, in a way, I suppose it's just informed approaches for pieces like that.
Yeah.
It's the only evaluation gig I've done where I had to spend 4 days in a pub,
Oh, nightmare.
which is terrible.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I wasn't collecting MSc stories except in my head.
Yes. Yes.
Really.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good. So you've talked quite a bit about some of the sort of different ways in which it's, I guess, shaped the kind of work that you do, both about, I guess, sort of about it becoming a kind of firm tool, about you doing more evaluation,
Mm.
about you, I guess, getting involved at a deeper level with some of the evaluations that you do, both in terms of kind of building capacity of organisations, getting really sort of under the kind of hood, I guess, and also the fact that it's kind of, that kind of narrative way of working has kind of infused evaluations that you're doing even when you're not explicitly
Mm.
using MSc, really. So yeah, I guess just any sort of reflections really on which of the most, which of those changes have been the most significant, and why for you?
Well, I suppose probably the most significant, the most fundamental, is that deepening interest in story and how it works
Yeah,
and where it's found.
yeah,
Um, uh, as I say, part of my interest in this technique has been the that I'm a writer and a reader.
yes, yeah.
Um, and that flows through pretty much everything I do, really, I suppose, in different ways. Um, so it's been about that. Practice, I suppose. That's the thing, is, it's I really enjoy it when I've got an MSc thing on, because it's that practice of, how do I get that conversation down to a side that tells the story, that
Yeah.
feels true. There's not my story, this is not, for me, it's not a journalistic
No.
thing particularly. It's about trying to shape the story, shape the text so that that person feels their story is there.
Yes, I
That's
always
what I
liken
always
it
feel
to.
like I'm doing when I'm writing
Yeah,
it up.
I liken it to being a ghostwriter. I often say to
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
we're going to write this story together. Don't worry, we've got a structure. I'm not expecting you to just launch into it, and I'm going to act as your ghostwriter
Yeah,
because I know
that's a good way of thinking
you're a
about it.
busy person. I'm going to take notes, record the session. I'm going to go off. I'm going to write this up in the first person, using as many of your words as I can organize onto the page, and then I'm going to come back to you, and you can read that through, change it in any way you want. But I'm sort of, it's yeah, I'm acting there, writing on your behalf, and that's
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's a
No,
really
that's
interesting role, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it.
yeah.
Um, uh, because yeah, I think, and that's different. Sometimes people say, "What's the difference between an MSc story and a case study?"
Ah, yeah, yeah, good point.
And I think that's so the writing up of an MSc
Mm.
story for me is really different from a case study. Because if I'm writing a case study, I've got a set of things that I
Mm.
want to make sure that example gets across.
Yes.
And I am writing it in a more, let's say, journalistic, because it's not academic kind of thing. But I'm this what I write has to demonstrate through the activities that I'm describing, you know, 1, 2, or 3 points.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not the case when I'm writing up a story. What I'm trying to do there is, what was the story that mattered to that person I spoke
Yes.
to,
Yeah.
and how do I best get it across in the context of the work that we're doing? So I've got a length limitation and so on and so forth. But
Yeah. Yeah.
they're really different, and sometimes that's a distinction that sometimes people kind of grapple with a little bit, because we're used to case studies and evaluations.
We are, yeah, yeah. And we're used to writing about people in the third person, aren't we, in those case
Yeah, yeah,
studies? Bob is he came to our organization X, this happened. And instead, I would always write an MSc story in the, as an I or we, or,
yeah. I would
you're
tend
writing
to.
for that person in the first person. And it's a very different relationship to the material, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I've got a little exercise that I do in some of when I've got time in training, if the training is long enough, where I've taken a story and I've rewritten it in a couple
Mm,
of different ways. So moving it from fairly long, like 700 words in the first person, to 400 words in the first person, to 350 words in the third person.
mm,
Um, and if you want brevity, third person is probably easier. It's
yes.
more effective,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
usually. But it's really interesting. And what I do is I ask people, you know, which of these stories, what are the pros and cons of each approach?
Yeah, nice. I like
And
that.
it's really interesting because some people go towards that third person, and probably about an even number of other people go against that, because
Oh,
it's so. And that might just be the way I did it when I was writing that example, but I suspect not. That the immediately you move to the third person, you're editorializing.
yeah.
It is so hard not to editorialize in the third
Yeah,
person.
yeah, that's
You
interesting.
know,
Mm,
she
mm,
became more confident,
mm. Yeah,
um,
yeah. And who gets to
etc.
decide and who's
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
it?
So,
Yeah, yeah.
even doing that into building that into the training has helped me think about it more when I'm writing it up. So I'm probably yeah, very occasionally I'll write something in the third person, particularly if that person doesn't. Sometimes I might even ask people.
Mm,
Sometimes if people aren't confident about sharing their story and maybe want it slightly anonymized or something like that,
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
third person can be helpful in that. Um, uh, but yeah, generally I think people engage more immediately with the first person.
Mm,
Um, but it's interesting because in literary, if you were thinking about this in literary terms, writers would probably say, a lot of prose writers would say, the first person is harder
yeah, yeah, yeah. It
to
is.
write in.
Yeah, definitely. No, I'm sure it is. And I think that point about, there's a real principle running through MSC, isn't there, that we're not attributing changes to other people. We're talking about changes that matter to ourselves, really. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that trying to write it in the first person becomes a real test of that. But I agree, there's times when you might not.
yeah,
I'm just, yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about, that story of your own journey that you've shared with us, Mark. And I suppose I'm just wondering, if you were going to give that story a title, does anything to leap to mind?
yeah. This is the bit where people always go, "Oh no," isn't it?
Oh, I know.
In that, and it's not part of this. Is I think this isn't part of the Rick Davis and Jess Dart technique, is it? The title, I don't think, but
Probably not. No, but
um, I
sometimes some people
suppose
enjoy it.
I, I, I people often do. I suppose it's probably something like deeper into story, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, uh, yeah, there's something about going deeper
yeah,
for
yeah.
me,
Yes.
um, and I think that's often because as if when you're an external evaluator or working in that consultancy field, the chance to deepen practice, you have to take the chances to deepen practice when you
Yeah,
get them. That's
yeah,
my experience, because
yeah, yeah.
otherwise, the downside of the Swiss Army knife approach is you go, what tool do I need now?
Mm,
And you apply it, and that can be
yeah,
very effective, very cost effective, etc. But the risk in being a Swiss Army knife is you don't go deep.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And for me, this has been an opportunity to do that, I suppose.
Yeah, and to give
Yeah,
organizations the structure and the skills and the confidence with which they
yeah,
can
yeah,
continue that deepening, which is,
yeah. To
and
pass that
democratize
on
that, and
and
to,
spread
yeah,
it, because I think that depth of thinking that you can get when you think about story in a structured way is something that could lead to a healthier sector. That's what, I suppose that's what I'm always thinking about, is how does this help us lead to a more effective, more equitable, more resilient sector?
brilliant. Well,
Um,
thank you. That's a great place to end, I reckon. Thank you so much. It's been
yeah, yeah.
really,
No,
really
my
great
pleasure.
to
It's
unpick
really,
all of that.
really good to think about it.
Yeah, it's nice to have
In this kind
create
of
a
way.
space
Yeah,
to reflect ourselves, isn't it?
yeah,
We
yeah.
often don't get much time as evaluators to do that, really. So,
No,
yeah,
people really need to build that in, because yeah, where everyone's so busy, it's often on to the next thing, isn't it? So
yeah,
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 it's
yeah.
good. Well, I shall
Absolutely. Good, good, good. Well,
look
we'll have a
forward to
look.
it.
I mean, don't think there was anything in there that we wouldn't want to include, but we'll have a little look and
Okay.
just check the length and everything of it all. I'm
Yeah.
paranoid. I've
Times it
checked it.
now.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's about right.
yeah, I think it's probably about right because we did quite a
Yeah.
bit of chat before it. So
Yeah.
yeah, good, brilliant. Oh,
Good.
thank you so much,
Excellent.
Mark. I'll
No, that's all
obviously
right.
let you have a look at it before we post it or anything. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
brilliant. Thank you
Good.
so much for your time.
Great.
Share that.
Great.
All right then.
It's funny when I wrote something about doing thinking practice 15 years recently on my newsletter, and I
Yeah.
nearly put in. And the good news is I haven't started a podcast.
Well, we turned 15 about, was it last year? I
Right,
think, yeah, I think we're coming up to 16 in September, I think. So yeah, it's obviously
right.
the sort of thing you do, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah. No,
like when you
no,
paint your bedroom black and start a podcast series.
yeah, I can't remember what did my bedroom look like when I was 15. It was tiny, I tell you that. I had my sister had the big room and I had the box room. You could touch both walls if you did that in that room. Um, and the immersion. It's funny. I'm having a flashback now. To yeah, tiny little box room with the old fashioned immersion heater in the
Oh yeah,
built
yeah,
in the corner
yeah, yeah.
in
I
the
know.
cupboard.
In like a
Um,
cupboard, yeah,
uh, but I can't remember what it looked like at 15.
yeah.
There was a certain point where I covered every inch of the walls and the cupboards with like pictures and quotes from the NME.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah,
I think I was
definitely.
14 then. Maybe
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
grown out of that by the time I was 15.
Yeah, very sophisticated by then. That was all
Yeah,
a bit
I was reading
childish.
I was reading Jean-Paul Sartre by 15.
Oh, obviously.
Far too young. I didn't understand the
Yeah,
brain working
yeah,
like
I
that.
know. I read all the good books far too young. Now I can't be asked to read them again. But
Well,
yeah,
you've got time yet. You've got time yet.
hopefully.
Yeah, good.
All
Great.
right,
No, that
then,
was
Mark.
really interesting. That was really
Yeah,
good.
it's
Thank
good.
you.
So it's really,
Yeah.
really, really great conversation. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right,
No
then,
worries.
be in
All
touch
right. Have a
soon.
good day. Have a good weekend when
You
it comes.
too.
See you
Take
later.
care. Bye.